Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking a sledgehammer to that classic dawn of the century myth and uncovering the incredibly gritty, complex reality of how our world actually industrialized. You know, when we think of the Industrial Revolution, we almost always imagine this sudden, magical explosion of towering smokestacks, gleaming machinery, and total overnight societal transformation. But we're going to dive into the data, the history, and the actual lived experiences of the people who were there. And as you'll see, the real story is so much more fascinating and honestly, way messier than the neat little timelines we usually see in history books.
Just look at how people talked about this era right at the dawn of the 20th century. Society completely glorified machines as the ultimate triumph of modern development. The imagery they used was just incredibly powerful. I mean, trade magazines were literally comparing industrial mechanics to Aladdin's magic. The underlying message was crystal clear. The East, with all its traditions, was the past, and the West, armed with modern tools and steam power, was the triumphant, unstoppable future. This kind of glorification really shaped our popular imagination, making industrialization look like this straight, glorious line of continuous progress.
But we really have to ask ourselves, was industrialization actually an overnight technological miracle? Spoiler alert, the truth is far slower and much more complicated than just throwing a switch and building a factory. Did steam and iron instantly replace human hands? Did machines just immediately wipe out traditional crafts? Well, absolutely not.
Part 1. The slow pace of change. Let's uncover the muddy reality of early industry.
Long before those massive factories dominated the skyline, we had a phase historians like to call proto-industrialization. It's a bit of a mouthful, but the concept is brilliant. Back then, powerful urban trade guilds strictly controlled production and pretty much blocked any new businesses from opening in towns. So merchants needed a workaround. And what did they do? They went rogue. They turned to the countryside, advancing money to poor peasants and artisans. These rural workers would produce goods for a massive international market right from their tiny family farm plots, which was a lifesaver for supplementing their shrinking agricultural income.
Picture this. It's like a giant invisible assembly line stretched out across the entire English landscape. A single clothier could control hundreds of family farm workers. A merchant buys the wool, transports it miles to rural spinners, passes that yarn along to weavers, then fullers, and finally, the whole thing gets dyed and finished in London for export. There is no massive factory roof over their heads here, just a highly decentralized, incredibly intricate network of manual labor.
Okay, I want you to think about this number for a second. 321. That was the total number of steam engines in all of England at the beginning of the 19th century. Just 321. We're talking about the nation that literally invented the Industrial Revolution, and out of those few engines, only 80 were actually used in cotton industries. You see, new technology was outrageously expensive. It broke down all the time, and the repair costs were just astronomical. Industrialists were incredibly cautious. They didn't just blindly buy into the hype and adopt machines overnight.
Plus, there was a really harsh economic logic driving this hesitation. Over in 19th century America, severe labor shortages practically forced businesses to adopt mechanization. But Victorian Britain, human labor was dirt cheap. Industrialists actually preferred hand labor most of the time. In industries with seasonal demands like gas works or breweries, it was simply cheaper to hire desperate people for a few months than to sink capital into a machine. Why buy a steam engine when thousands of workers, like the famous trade unionist Will Thorne, would literally walk 20 miles a day, sleeping under haystacks and in old farm sheds just to secure seasonal, manual labor?
Moving to Part 2, the fall of Indian textiles. Let's look at the colonial impact of British industrialization.
This whole shift triggered a devastating global ripple effect, especially for the incredibly vibrant Indian textile trade. Historically, fine Indian cotton and silk totally dominated the global market, flowing out of bustling ports like Surat. But as European companies gained power, that entire centuries-old network was violently dismantled. By the 1850s, cheap machine-made goods from Manchester completely flooded India, destroying the local market. And if that wasn't enough, when the American Civil War kicked off in the 1860s, it cut off U.S. cotton supplies to Britain. So Britain started buying up India's raw cotton at exorbitant prices, totally starving Indian weavers of their own raw materials.
But here's the really crucial point. The East India Company didn't eliminate competition just by having better technology. They used predatory advances and violent oversight to literally trap Indian weavers. They brought in these paid servants called gomastas. Now, unlike the old local supply merchants who actually lived in the villages and helped weavers out during hard times, the gomastas were arrogant outsiders. They handed out loans that legally tied the weavers exclusively to the company, and if there were delays, they would march into villages with armed sepoys actively beating and flogging the weavers. This was an industrial monopoly enforced by sheer physical violence.
Which brings us to part 3, the rise of Indian factories, moving from global collapse to local industrial rebound. Despite these massive setbacks, local entrepreneurs fought back. Groups like the Parsis and Marwaris, many of whom had originally built up their wealth through the China trade, started opening their own cotton and jute mills. Factory employment absolutely surged. We're talking from just over 500,000 workers in 1901 to nearly 2.5 million by 1946. These workers were mostly poor peasants streaming in from neighboring districts. But getting a job wasn't exactly fair or easy. They usually had to rely on these powerful middlemen called jobbers. A jobber was an old, trusted worker who controlled all the recruitment, and over time they essentially became gatekeepers, demanding money and gifts just to secure a desperate villager a spot on the factory floor.
Part 4. Survival of the small and the hidden strength of the handloom.
Now, you'd probably think these massive factories just wiped out traditional craftspeople entirely, right? Actually, large factories were just a tiny segment of the economy. Small-scale artisans didn't just survive, they actually expanded their cloth production well into the 20th century. How? By adapting. They adopted clever new tools like the fly shuttle, which seriously boosted their productivity. But more importantly, they focused on intricate designs that massive machines simply couldn't replicate. A steam-powered loom in Manchester literally couldn't weave the complex borders of a Banarasi sari. Plus, the wealthy elites who bought these fine goods didn't stop buying them even during famines, giving these highly skilled handloom weavers a remarkably resilient market.
Finally, part 5, selling the industrial age. Let's talk about marketing the modern world.
Okay, so you've got all these new, mass-produced goods flooding the market. How do you actually get the public to buy them? Manufacturers used incredibly manipulative marketing. When Manchester cloth entered India, it carried bold, Made in Manchester labels to guarantee quality. But then they went a step further. They literally plastered images of familiar local gods, like Krishna or Saraswati, directly onto these foreign products. Think about the subliminal message there. Even the gods approve of Manchester cloth. They also printed beautiful illustrated calendars, because even folks who couldn't read would hang them up in tea shops and poor homes, absorbing that advertisement day after day, all year round.
But I love this next part, because Indian manufacturers completely flipped the script. They turned those exact same advertising channels into a powerful vehicle for the nationalist Swadeshi movement. They cleverly pushed a message of self-reliance, using labels that depicted Indian goddesses actively offering cloth produced in local mills, directly pleading with the populace to boycott foreign goods. It just goes to show how industrialization wasn't just a battle of machines and steam, it was a full-on battle for consumer culture and national identity.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with something to really chew on. Considering the massive displacement of rural workers, the grueling manual labor, the violent colonial monopolies, and the incredibly complex survival tactics of small artisans we've uncovered today, what does the angel of progress truly cost us? Industrialization brought undeniable technological marvels, for sure, but it was built on the backs of millions whose lives were totally upended. Thank you so much for joining me to explore the messy, fascinating reality behind the myth. I really hope this gives you a completely new perspective the next time you look down and see a Made in label.